Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Catholicism, a podcast about Catholic teaching and why it makes sense. I'm your host, Caitlin West. Hey friends, welcome to our very last episode in this deep dive into the Bible. Oh my gosh, we're nearly there. And before we get started, I want to just take this moment to say a quick thank you to the people on Patreon who've been supporting this podcast. I don't say it often enough. I'm going to remedy that. Thank you. You guys are incredible. You genuinely make this work actually possible. At the moment, I have like a real life job, but my real life job is not full time. And the only reason why I'm able to do that real life job not full time is because of the help of patrons. Like, it makes a tangible difference to the amount of time that I can spend devoted to this. So thank you so much. Okay, let's get into it. So in our last episode, we looked at internal and external difficulties in the Bible. So points of history or science don't seem to match up. In this episode, we're going to conclude by looking at moral difficulties in the Bible. So basically moments when it seems like the Bible, or even God through the Bible, is condoning things like violence or slavery or even genocide. So basically, most of the moral difficulties that people come up against when they read the Bible occur in the Old Testament. Moments in the Old Testament where God seems particularly harsh or even cruel. And actually, all of these problems kind of come together to form a main problem or claim. And this claim is that the God of the Old Testament is very different from the God of the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament seems to be really angry and jealous and wrathful and even unjust, whereas the God of the New Testament, i.e. Jesus, is loving and benevolent and kind and gentle. Now, this claim is actually a form of an ancient heresy, which we call Marcionism. So Marcionism was a 2nd century heresy that was propagated by a guy called Marcion. And his claim was that the Old Testament and New Testament gods were not the same God because they were irreconcilable. Now, this was actually a widely condemned heresy at the time. So Marcion's contemporaries condemned it as a heresy, most famously Tertullian, who's one of the early church fathers. And Marcion was actually excommunicated from the church around 144 AD. So this is actually kind of a long-standing question that people have raised. How do we reconcile the Old Testament and the New Testament gods? How can they be the same being when they seem so different? Well, okay, there's a couple of things to say here. The first thing is we need to clarify this idea that Jesus is just like Captain Fun Times and he only ever talks about sunshine and butterflies and love your neighbor, and that the Old Testament God is like angry as and just constantly yelling at people and getting jealous and mad and punishing everyone. That is a major, massive oversimplification of the reality. In reality, the person who talks the most about hell and eternal damnation in the whole Bible is, guess who? Jesus. He is the person who talks about hell and everlasting damnation more than anyone else. Not only that, but the God of the Old Testament, if you actually read the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament is like constantly talking about his love for his people and how he is like desperate in that love to kind of draw his people closer to him and to heal them from their sin. So this idea that there's just some black and white complete difference between the Old Testament and New Testament God is a massive overstatement. Having said that, we might hear that and be like, yeah, okay. So Jesus does talk about hell and the Old Testament God does talk about love, but there is still like a pretty clear difference. Like the Old Testament God does sound kind of different from Jesus. So for instance, like Jesus is the one who tells us to love God and love your neighbor. He's the one that we get the golden rule from. Like the Old Testament God is not saying that. Well, actually, the God of the Old Testament is telling people to love God and love their neighbor. And we know this because Jesus himself tells us that that's the case. So in Matthew chapter 22, Jesus says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And then he says, "The whole law and the prophets depend on these 2 commandments." So what is he saying here? What he's saying is that the golden rule already exists in the Old Testament. It is embedded, in fact, it is at the very heart of the entire law and the prophets. The whole of the Old Testament is kind of undergirded by this fundamental rule, love God and love your neighbor. All Jesus is doing is he is drawing that out and making it explicit. And this is what Jesus himself tells us. I have come not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. Now, why is that the case? Why is it that Jesus has to kind of draw out these things and make them explicit? Well, here we go back to something that we said all the way back in one of our earliest episodes, which is this concept of +1 learning. Okay, what do we mean by that? Well, this is something that Father Mike Schmitz talks about, that in the Old Testament, we read how Adam and Eve, when they said no to God's grace, they kind of set fire to the relationship between humanity and God. So all of that love, that supernatural charity that existed in humankind was kind of cut off at the knees. Our capacity to live a life of grace was lost. And we had to learn kind of from scratch how to love God and love our neighbor once again. And this is an analogy we've used before, but it's worth revisiting. So imagine if I was like a world-renowned physicist, right? And I got into a car accident and I lost all of my memories of physics. And I wanted to regain those memories. I wanted to get back to the point where I could do hardcore physics again. Well, obviously, if that were the case, I'd lost all my memories. I'm not going to jump straight back into hardcore physics, right? I'm going to have to start learning again from scratch. So I'm going to have to start with basic maths. 1 + 1 = 2. Or another analogy we could use is, imagine if I was like a marathon runner and then I had some sort of injury and I had to relearn how to use my legs again. Well, the first thing I have to do before I can start running marathons again is to learn how to walk. I have to learn how to walk before I can learn how to run. So something similar can be said for humanity, right? When Adam and Eve cut humanity off from a relationship with God, God had to kind of reintroduce himself to us bit by bit over time. So Adam and Eve have kind of set the house on fire and burnt it to the ground, right? And rather than abandoning us, God meets humanity right where it is and starts to build that house back up from the ground up. So from those charred remains, God starts to lay the foundations, right? Slowly drawing his people back in. But just like the physicist who has to start with 1 + 1 = 2, God couldn't just like jump straight into the golden rule, love God and love your neighbor, right? He's dealing with the people who have descended into sin and depravity. So he has to start with the most basic, fundamental moral principles. So that's why in the Old Testament, we hear God telling his people multiple times, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now we hear that today and we're like, wow, that's God being like, telling people to get revenge on each other. No, that's God saying, when someone hurts you, don't go overboard in your reaction. Okay, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Don't go overboard. In other words, he's teaching his people justice. Okay, they have to start with justice before they can learn mercy. And then once they have learned justice, then they can learn mercy. So by the time we get to Jesus in the New Testament, now God is able to say to his people, okay, so you understand an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but now you need to learn how to turn the other cheek. Now you need to learn how to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So from the Old Testament to the New Testament, God has to build his people up bit by bit so that they are ultimately capable of living the golden rule. But that doesn't mean that it's like the golden rule is like a brand new idea that's introduced in the New Testament. It exists. It's already there embedded in the Old Testament, but Jesus has to make it explicit when he comes. So this is the Catechism, point 53. It refers to this process, this kind of +1 learning process, as a divine pedagogy. Pedagogy meaning teaching. So it says, God communicates himself to man gradually. He prepares him to welcome by stages the supernatural revelation that is to culminate in the person and mission of the incarnate Word, Jesus Christ. Now, part of that process, a kind of +1 learning, involves God having a different approach to the way he teaches his people in the Old Testament than he does in the New. So sometimes we look at the God of the Old Testament and we think, gosh, he sounds really kind of strict and harsh, whereas with the God of the New Testament sounds really gentle. Okay, well, think of it this way. Imagine that you have like a small child. And this child is not only very young, but also has like major behavioral issues. So this is a kid with oppositional defiance disorder. Everything you tell him, he's going to do the opposite. Well, you can imagine that if you were the parent of that kid, you might need to be stricter with that child when they're young and still learning. And once that child gets older and some of those behavioral issues have been resolved, then you might be able to shift your tone and approach in disciplining that child. Now, that doesn't mean that as a parent, you love the child any more or less at any point in their development, or that you're kind of moving the goalposts in terms of what's right and wrong. It just means that human beings need different things at different stages of their development. And the same thing can be said for humanity. God suits his ways of dealing with his people to their needs at that particular time. Okay, now we might hear all of this and think, yes, so let's accept that God had to kind of teach his people gradually. He reveals things gradually, and then Jesus fulfills and completes that teaching in the New Testament. And that's why there seems to be a different kind of tone in the Old Testament from the New Testament. But there are still moments in the Old Testament where it's not just that like God sounds a bit strict, or that like he sounds a little bit harsh. It's more like it seems that God is being properly mean or even evil. Like, there are moments in the Old Testament where God seems to condone violence or even genocide. Like, that's not him slowly revealing things over time. That seems pretty contradictory to what Jesus says in the New Testament. If God is saying that slavery is good, then surely that's in direct opposition to what Jesus says in the New Testament. Oh, great questions. Love them all. Thanks for asking. So let's walk through a few of those instances in the Old Testament and see what we can make of them. And I will preface all of this by saying what I've said before, which is that if you want to read about these issues in greater depth, I really recommend Trent Horn's book, Hard Sayings, because he covers a lot of this stuff in much greater detail. But let's look through a few of them now. Okay, let's just start with the moments where God seems to get really angry. So here's a couple of quotes from the Old Testament. 2 Kings 13, it says, "For the rage of the Lord has been set furiously ablaze against us." Or then in Isaiah 13:9, it says, "Indeed, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and burning anger, to lay waste to the land and destroy the sinners within it." Okay, now that doesn't just sound like a God who's being a little bit strict. That sounds like a God who is very angry and perhaps even being like petty or like out of control. The first thing to say here is to clarify that God does not experience emotions in the way that human beings do. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's think about what an emotional response is. What happens when I feel an emotion? Well, an emotion is a psychological and physiological reaction to a stimulus, okay? It is a change in my emotional state. I go from being happy to sad in response to something that has happened. Now, God, by definition, cannot change. God is the fullness of being. There is nothing in him that can become more or less. God is. God cannot change. Now, not only can God not change, but God is also omniscient, which means that he knows everything and he can see all things. So it's not like he can be surprised or caught off guard or have a kind of knee-jerk emotional reaction to something that I have done. So that's what we mean when we say that God doesn't experience emotions in the way that we do. So if that's the case, then why does the Bible describe him as angry? Why does it keep talking about the wrath and rage of God? Well, basically, these descriptions of God in the Old Testament are what we refer to as anthropomorphic metaphors. Big words. Basically, it just means that it's a way of using human experience and human attributes to try to understand or express something about God. This is something we do all the time. So like, for instance, if my laptop is playing up, I might be like, oh, my computer hates me today. Or if there's a storm outside, I might say, oh, that's a really angry storm. Now, in those moments, I'm not actually saying that my computer has feelings or that the storm is angry. I'm using words that make sense to me as a human being to try to express something about, the fact that my computer isn't working or that the weather is super intense. So when we talk about the wrath of God, that language in the Old Testament is a kind of metaphorical way of expressing something true about God, but it's not literal language. Okay, so what's the true thing that we're expressing when we talk about the wrath of God? This is how Pope Benedict XVI puts it. He says, the wrath of God is a way of saying that I have been living in a way that is contrary to the love that is God. The punishment of God is in fact an expression for having missed the right road and then experiencing the consequences that follow from taking the wrong track and wandering away from the right way of living. So what is Pope Benedict XVI saying there? He's saying that when we talk about experiencing the wrath of God, we're talking about experiencing the consequences of our actions. So it's kind of like if you go over to a fire and then you stick your hand into it and you feel pain, it's not that the fire has gone out of its way to hurt you. It's that the fire is very hot. And when you stick your hand in it, you feel the pain that comes from sticking your hand in the fire. So in the same way, when we disobey God, i.e. when we reject love and we reject goodness, we experience the pain that comes from rejecting love and goodness, whether that be spiritual, emotional, moral pain or actual tangible consequences in our lives. So this is how Trent puts it. He says, saying God is angry at our sin or pleased with our obedience doesn't mean God is reacting to something we did. It means we did something to alienate ourselves from God or to draw us closer to Him. Okay, here's another example. What about in the Bible when it tells us that God hardened someone's heart? So this comes up in the book of Exodus, where it tells us that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would not let the children of Israel go. Now, we might read that and be like, well, that's not very nice of God. Why would he harden someone's heart? Why wouldn't he soften that person's heart? Well, again, here we are describing the effects of sin. So again, this is how Trent puts it. He says, when we read that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, it's easy to assume that God did something to Pharaoh in order to cause his heart to become stubborn and hard. But you can cause something to become hard just by leaving it alone, like when bread is left out on the counter overnight. Father Mike Schmitz says something similar in the Bible in a Year. He talks about how when you place wax under the sun, it melts, but when you put clay out in the sun, it hardens. And he talks about the disposition of a person's heart. If my heart is disposed to do good, then in the presence of God, it will soften. But if it is disposed towards evil, then my heart will harden in the presence of God. So when God says he will harden Pharaoh's heart, he's not saying I'm going to go in and mess with his heart and make him cruel and stubborn. He's saying, okay, if Pharaoh doesn't want to listen to me, then I'm going to leave him to it. And his heart will naturally harden because in his will, he is not disposed to say yes to God's grace. Okay, next question. What about times when God actively punishes people in ways that feel unfair? So there are multiple stories of kind of really intense punishments for evil in the Old Testament. So things like God flooding the entire earth in the story of Noah, or destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, or sending plagues to Egypt and causing the death of every firstborn child in Egypt. So how can God do that? How can God commit such destruction against his people whom he claims to love? Well, we have to start, first of all, with this fundamental truth, which is that God is the author of life. All life comes from him because he is being itself. He is the one in whom all existence has its source. So our human lives are a real participation in the being that he shares with us. Now, if something belongs to me and I choose to share it, like I'd lend someone a book, I have the right to decide how long I lend it for and when I take it back. So Jimmy Akin makes a similar point about God. He says, all life is a gift from God, and God has a right to determine how much of that gift we receive and when and how it ends. Okay, but if we go back to our analogy of like if I lend a book to someone, we have to remember that with God, it goes even deeper because it's not like the life that he gives us is like a separate thing that he owns, like a book. Our existence is held in being constantly by the will of God, okay? God allows us to participate in being. So it follows that God has the authority to determine when a person's earthly life begins and ends. Importantly, God doesn't sort of exercise this authority to like begin and end life kind of arbitrarily, right? He's not like going around zapping people or like sending down lightning bolts to like burn them to a crisp every time they misuse the gift of life. Because if he did that, then we would all be dead because we all sin. So God has this authority to withdraw that gift of life, but he's not going around using it arbitrarily. Instead, what we see in the Old Testament is that God may permit the end of a life when that person or community has reached a level of depravity that threatens the covenant and corrupts others. So for example, cultures that engage in like child sacrifice, or in other instances, God may permit death in order to draw a greater good out of that tragic situation. And here we have to remember something that we've said before, that God's vision is different from ours. We can see this earthly life, he can see eternity, and his sights are set on our eternal salvation, on us being with him forever in heaven. So things that look like the tragic loss of life, which they are tragic in the Old Testament and even in the New, like we can think of the massacre of the innocents in the New Testament, we can think, why would God allow that to happen? Well, God is looking at the eternal salvation of those souls. So he may allow someone to die who is innocent in order to ultimately bring them into eternal ecstasy and communion with him in heaven forever. So this is how Jimmy Akin puts it. He says, death is not the end. Whatever the circumstances of a particular death, it is a finite evil. Eternity lies before us, and God is capable of more than compensating the innocent who have suffered or died. Okay, so now we hit a biggie. What do we do with moments in the Bible where God seems to be condoning or even encouraging things like slavery or genocide? Strap in. So let's start with genocide. Okay, let's start with genocide. That's so easy. So this is a quote from Joshua 10:40. It says, "So Joshua defeated the whole land, the hill country and the Negeb, and the lowland and the slopes, and all their kings. He left no one remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed, as the Lord God of Israel had commanded." Whoo! That is some heavy stuff. So in that moment, it seems like God has commanded Joshua to commit genocide, to destroy everyone in the land of Canaan. Okay, now the apologist Joe Heschmeyer has a really fantastic video that goes for about 45 minutes where he unpacks this whole question of whether God encourages genocide in the Bible. So I really recommend watching that. I'll put it in the show notes. But basically the conclusion that he comes to, and this is like a common argument that is made, not just by Catholic apologists, but also by many historians, is that when we read these bits in the Bible where it describes an entire people being wiped out, it is highly unlikely that this is a description of a literal genocide that actually took place. And in fact, this is an example of a very common kind of hyperbolic language that is often employed, not just in the Bible, but in ancient communities at this time when describing victory in battle. Okay. Now you might have heard that and been like, oh, come on, that's such a like convenient excuse. It's like a way of Christians to kind of invent an explanation for that part of the Bible. But it says that he wiped out everyone. Come on. Okay, well, actually, no, this isn't just like a convenient explanation. This is something that we know for a fact about ancient modes of expression. So this quote comes from the professor of Egyptology, Kenneth Kitchen, who wins the award for best name. Kenneth Kitchen, I'm just going to say it again, refers to this kind of description that sounds like it's describing a genocide. He describes it as a type of rhetoric which was a regular feature of military reports in the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. So basically, this kind of writing, this kind of exaggerated description of battle, is something that we find not just in the Bible, it's actually part of like a broader cultural way of describing events. And actually, this kind of hyperbole is something that we've come up in multiple instances during this deep dive of the Bible. The fact that exaggeration was often used as like a rhetorical device in the Bible, not to deceive people, because it was actually understood by people of the time that that was metaphorical language, right? It was a way of expressing victory or expressing that someone was really important. So remember when we talked about how like people were described as living for hundreds of years as a way of indicating that they were an important or influential person. So Joe Heschmeyer goes on to give two examples that kind of like substantiate this idea that these descriptions that sound like genocide in the Old Testament were a deliberate rhetorical device that people at the time would have understood as metaphorical. So first of all, he talks about Joshua chapter 11. So in Joshua chapter 11, it describes Joshua wiping out the Anakim in the land of Canaan. It says he struck them down until they had left no one remaining. Okay, so apparently he's eradicated all of the Anakim. But then 3 chapters later, in chapter 14, Caleb asks Joshua if he can inherit the hill country from Joshua because he wants to drive the Anakim out. So, okay, clearly they're still very much there, even though we heard 3 chapters earlier that not a single one of them was remaining. Heschmeyer also uses another example of the story of David in the book of Samuel. So David, as a young boy, has just defeated Goliath. And after that defeat, the women of Israel all come out and they begin to sing and dance in celebration. And they begin to say, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Okay, so in this instance, the death of one person, Goliath, has become the death of tens of thousands of people. So Heschmeyer comments that the point of this figure of speech is to say, Saul is glorious, David is very glorious. Saul is victorious, David is very victorious. Okay, so that's another example where we can clearly see that sort of hyperbolic language being deliberately used and understood by communities at that time as an expression of victory in battle rather than a description of genocide. And actually what we're doing right now is doing like what we should always do when we read the Bible, understanding when each book was written, where it was written, what its genre was, and what kind of modes or conventions of expression were used at the time, rather than reading the Bible from like a 21st century perspective as though it was written now. Okay, so that's genocide. Now let's talk about slavery, the other fun one. Okay, so slavery comes up a lot in the Bible. There are a lot of rules in the Old Testament law, like in Leviticus, that kind of regulate how slavery could or couldn't kind of be lived out. Now, when we think about this issue of slavery in the Bible, the first thing we need to do is define what we're actually talking about, because we use that word, slavery, and when we hear it today, and again, we're in the 21st century, so we're thinking about like what that term immediately evokes in our minds might be the kind of like race-based, what we would call chattel slavery of the American South. So what is chattel slavery? Well, basically it's a form of slavery in which a person is basically turned into a piece of property to be bought and sold. They are owned by another person. They are enslaved for the whole of their life. Their children are automatically enslaved, and they are afforded limited to no individual rights. So that's the kind of form of slavery that we might be the most familiar with. That is not the form of slavery that the Old Testament is talking about. The Old Testament concept of slavery was something different. It referred to a form of servitude that was often a way of like surviving famine or paying off a debt. So if you couldn't pay your debts, you might enter into a form of like indentured labor for a set period of time in order to pay off those debts. So that's what we're referring to as slavery in this context. Now, obviously, even that form of indentured servitude is not ideal. Like, that's not God's plan for humanity. But it's not the same as the chattel slavery of more recent history that we might be familiar with. Slavery in the Old Testament had clear limits that are set out in the Bible, such as a mandatory release period after a set period of time, so you couldn't just be enslaved for the whole period of your life, as well as legal protections against mistreatment. So these are the sorts of regulations and limitations that are being outlined in the Bible. Now, again, we might think, yeah, okay, well, like this form of slavery is not as bad as chattel slavery, but like it's still pretty bad. And why is the Bible providing rules on like how to carry it out? Like surely that means that the Bible is condoning slavery. Well, here we need to remember the difference between condoning something and regulating it. So in the Bible, slavery is not being condoned or encouraged, it's being regulated and limited. Basically, slavery was like a widespread practice that was deeply embedded in the cultures of that time. And it was not good. It was not part of God's plan for human beings, even if it wasn't as bad as chattel slavery. But at the same time, and here we go back to the like +1 learning discussion from earlier, it wasn't the kind of thing that could just be like eliminated immediately from the culture. It had to first be regulated before it could eventually be removed. So this is how Trent Horn puts it. He says, instead of issuing shrill universal condemnations of slavery in the Bible that would have been ignored by most people, the laws set down in Scripture progressively guide God's people towards the eventual rejection of slavery. The laws did this while tolerating the existence of slavery because of the hard hearts of people who believed it was an indispensable source of labor. As Scripture scholar Richard Bauckham wrote, the Bible accepts the fact of slavery, but treats it as an abnormality to be minimized as far as possible. Okay, so genocide and slavery. Tick. Now, what about, finally, this is our last question, what do we do with instances when we're not talking about God condoning things, but more people in the Bible doing terrible things? Because this is the thing, throughout the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, we see acts of violence, we see things like rape, we see adultery, we see murder. Like there are acts, we even see incest. There are acts of depravity throughout the whole Bible. So how should we deal with these moments? Like, does this mean that the Bible is in some way evil or that it's promoting evil? Okay, well, this is how Trent Horn puts it. And I really like it because it's very pithy and helpful. He says, just because the Bible records it doesn't mean God recommends it. I'm going to say it again. Just because the Bible records it doesn't mean God recommends it. So, like we said right at the beginning of this deep dive, the Bible is ultimately the true story of the history of our salvation. It is the true story of the relationship between God and his people. And his people, as we know, are sinners. And throughout that history, which is a history of people who need salvation, of course, we are going to find many moments when people are doing very bad things. That is the reality of sin. It's the reality of like a fallen humanity that needs to be saved. And here we have to remember that the Bible isn't like a rule book. It's not a how-to manual. It is a record of the history of salvation. So it includes moments when people do incredibly depraved things. But again, just because the Bible records it doesn't mean that God recommends it. Cool. Okay. Wow. Nailed it. So that's it for this deep dive. How good. Thank you everyone for sticking with me. I've really enjoyed this. In our next episode, we're going to do one on a saint, Slay. We're going to do one on okay, I'm not going to tell you who it is, but I'll give you a hint. It's a Catholic saint who was recently given a very special title in the Catholic Church. That's all I'm going to give you. Cool. Okay, well, I can't wait for that. In the meantime, have a fantastic fortnight, and I can't wait to talk to you soon. Okay, bye. Tides will rise and fall along the bay, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere. People come and go